Are moving and grooving, and we are on to week 8 now, which is chapter 9. As promised, we are moving on to negative messages. Last week we did positive, the week before that, short messages, digital messages, and now here we go, week 8, chapter 9, negative messages. So, a few things you want to remember when dealing with negative messages. And remember, you can always get to these slides via your study tools at the end of the module. So, goals that we have when we're trying to convey negative news or unfavorable news. We want to make sure we're always explaining things clearly and completely. We want to make sure we seem sensitive when we're delivering this kind of news. We want to make sure we're very, very professional when we're delivering negative news. We want to always be fair, and we want to maintain really good relations, because we don't want, just because we have to say no about something now, we don't want that to mean we don't have a working relationship with someone in the future, with a customer, a colleague, whatever the case may be. As promised, again, I told you we would probably see this over and over each chapter. I warned you that it would become a little bit redundant, but again, they're pushing that you're going to use that 3 by 3 writing process, which means starting with our pre-writing, which is analyzing. So, especially when we're dealing with negative news, we want to make sure we're analyzing that bad news. Just how bad is bad? How is my audience going to receive it? Is it going to be extremely painful? How serious is it? If it's going to be very mild, then I could probably use direct strategy instead of indirect, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I'm going to use this first step to just kind of analyze how my audience is going to receive that information. Then we move to step 2, which you guys know is the drafting. So now we're researching, we're organizing and drafting. So we're gathering information, we're brainstorming, we're jotting down all the reasons why I have to give you this bad news. We want to give just our strongest and our safest. We want to be very careful that we're not getting ourselves into any kind of legal trouble when dealing with negative news and bad news. So we want to just list our strongest and safest reasons. We want to give as much information as we can and explanation, but we never want to fix blame. So we don't want to start pointing fingers, so to speak. And then, of course, we move to that third stage of the writing process, which is proofreading and editing. We want to make sure we really read the message carefully to make sure we said what we intended to say. We want to check our wording. We want to make sure we weren't insensitive or too abrupt with the negative news that we gave. We want to make sure that there's good coherency, good readability. We want people to be able to move from sentence to sentence and it flow very smoothly. We want to make sure our tone is very friendly, very respectful. And then, of course, with any document, we're going to check our grammar and our mechanics. And we just want to make sure that we're not too blunt, but also not too subtle. Some of you know, you've all had that person that you've dealt with before, that it didn't matter how many times you hinted around to know, they just didn't get it. And so you had to be very clear and just say no. And so we got to make sure we're not too subtle, as well as not too blunt. I told you this is a section where they really focus on avoiding that legal liability, especially when we're conveying negative news. We want to stay clear of using abusive language. This includes anything that would be on social networks, like social networking sites like Facebook and Twitter. We don't want to say anything or make any kind of statements that would be potentially damaging to myself, to my company, to my organization. We don't want anything to be misinterpreted. And in your text, it does a really good job of giving examples of all of these, but it really does on the good guy syndrome. And a lot of times people make very careless, very dangerous statements because they're trying to ease their own conscience. So, like, I think one of the examples in the book was an interviewing session happened, and a young lady did not get the job. And it was a whole team that was doing the interviewing. And so one of the gentlemen helping with the interviews happened to make a comment to the young lady um, that he thought she was the best one for the job, but unfortunately she didn't get the position. Now he did that so he would sound like the good guy in front of her. I thought you did good, but because of that, she took them to court and said it's very obvious if this gentleman sitting on the panel thought I was the best. The only reason I didn't get the job was because of my gender, and because they hired a male instead of a female for the position. But this guy said I was obviously the best one. And she won and she sued for a lot of money. And so we have to be very careful falling prey to that good guy syndrome. Make sure that you only express the views of your organization. When you are acting as a position for the organization, you represent the organization. So even if your thoughts and views are different, you have to be very careful not to cloud that, not to confuse that. You have to represent, you're acting as an agent for the organization. Don't give out information that could be twisted or misused. Use plain paper if you're sending out things or writing down personal matters. I have seen people write on letterhead different things that shouldn't have been written down, but the company, because it was on letterhead, is then held liable. And so, because it looks like it's a document coming from the company. So, be very careful. Don't admit or imply responsibility unless you go and you ask your legal team or your counsel there at your organization. I know doctors, this is a big deal with. Like, they are not supposed to say that they are sorry, and that's very hard when you have done something. When you feel bad for someone that's lost a loved one, you want to say, I'm sorry, because you are sorry for their loss. But by a doctor saying, I'm sorry, sometimes that could be the same as and taken as the same as admitting guilt. And so, like, they were negligent. And so we have to be very careful about that. Now, there are two strategies, and they really hit this hard in this chapter. And I believe we see it again in persuasive. And that is what we call direct strategy, getting to the point, like we've been doing all along, and coming out with what we need to say, or indirect strategy. And we've talked about that just briefly when we've talked about using passive voice. So, two different strategies, direct and indirect. So when do we use each of those? So we're going to use direct strategy when the bad news is not so damaging, when we think that maybe the bad news could even really be overlooked, when we know the person we're giving the news to prefers a very forward, a very direct way of it being delivered, and like we were talking about, when firmness is necessary, when we know sometimes if we're too elusive that people won't get it, it'll kind of go over their head. So those would be the cases when we'd want to use direct strategy. We'd want to use indirect strategy, of course, when the bad news is very personally upsetting. In the case of maybe letting someone go or having to take money out of their salary, we'd want to do this with indirect strategy. We'd also want to do it in person. When we know the bad news will provoke a very hostile reaction, if it threatens a relationship, a worker to worker relationship, a customer to company relationship, we want to keep those intact. So we'd want to use indirect. If it's unexpected, it's kind of coming out of nowhere, then we would want to do that. So here's what the two look like. I love this infographic. It really helps for you to visualize the difference in direct and indirect strategy. So with direct strategy, you simply do what we've been doing. You come right out, you give the bad news, then you list the reasons, and then you have a nice, pleasant closing that's going to hopefully preserve the relationship and keep things moving forward. We're going to use indirect strategy in the ways that we just talked about in the slide above. But to do that, we're going to do a buffer. Then we're going to give our reasons. And then and only then do we actually say, here's the bad news or here's the no. And that's for a lot of reasons. The buffer is there to kind of give us that distance. And then we give the reasons before we give the no or the bad news so that they're still able to digest those reasons. And then, of course, we end with a pleasant closing. So exactly what is a buffer? You've all probably used one, especially when you were a kid. Your parents leave you alone with a babysitter or with an older sibling. They ask you to keep things safe, don't break anything, and sure enough, what happens? You break something. So when they come in, instead of just running up and using direct strategy and say, Mom, Dad, I broke your expensive tea pitcher, or I broke your vase, or whatever the case may be, we say, how was the evening? You guys really deserved it. You're the best parents in the world. I'm so glad you got to go out. We're buffering before we get to, by the way, we broke your expensive vase. So it's there to kind of reduce the shock or pain. It's meant to be neutral but meaningful sometimes, so we can just keep them reading. It's concise, it's relevant. First paragraph providing a very natural transition to the explanation that we're going to give. So it kind of helps move things into the explanation. When we do give the reasons for a no, and we get to that point where we're giving the explanation, make sure that we're leading up to the no very clearly. If we can, if there's benefits for the no for the reader, for the audience, we want to make sure that we note those. We want to explain why we're having to do this now. This is why we can no longer accept payments cash payments and why we're doing things electronically. It's going to help you. It's going to help people. It's going to save us, the whatever the case may be. But you want to give the rationale behind the company's policy if you can. Choose very positive words. You can use positive words when giving negative news, and show fairness and serious intent when you do so. Then, of course, we always want to close pleasantly. The book goes through a lot of different ways that you can do that. You can do so by closing with a very forward look. You can give an alternative. I can't do this, but possibly I could do this for you. Good wishes. If you can offer coupons, freebies, samples, gifts, that's always a good thing. Invite the readers to consider other products if you can't give them help on a specific product. So these are all ways we can close in a positive way. Um, we say no to a lot of different things uh, throughout the most correspondence, most communication is going to be positive. We've talked about that before, but sometimes we have to say no to invitations. Sometimes we're going to have to explain to our customers that there's going to be a rate increase. Sometimes we have to refuse credit. So there's problems with orders. These are all different things that would come across as no's to these typical claims, typical requests, where we would have to deliver negative news. When we're dealing with unhappy customers, specifically when it's online, we want to be very careful and we want to be very timely. So we want to call or email the individual and reply to their post within 24 hours. And we want to describe the problem. And if we can, and apologize as quick as we can. This is something called past, present, future that we're looking at here when we're dealing with unhappy customers. We want to past explain why the problem occurred, then bring them to present. This is what we're doing currently, right now, present day, to resolve it. And then also future. How can we prevent this from happening again to them as our customer? So, great little technique, past, present, future, that you might want to check out and use. We always want to try to promote goodwill when we're dealing with unhappy customers. We want to do follow up messages. Um, uh, and we want to document those follow up conversations, document them with a phone call. This says promote goodwill by following up with a message that documents the phone call or acknowledges the online exchange. So once we've talked to them online, once we've talked to them on the phone, we may want to send an email or some type of thing that follows up what happened and how we're moving forward and how we're taking care of the situation. Sometimes it's very important that we have a hard copy. Written messages are important in the situations where we're wanting to keep and establish a record of the incident, when it's good for promoting goodwill, when we want to confirm exactly what we are going to do in order to follow up in this, what we're responsible for from here on out, to kind of rectify the situation. And if I can't talk to that customer personally, then email or a hard copy would definitely be the way to go. Consumers are going to complain online, but it's not going away. We have to learn how to deal with it. We have to realize the power in social networking sites and an online presence. And so they complain online because they know it's probably going to get a faster response. And it typically does. They want to sometimes gripe in public, so to speak, because they feel like they can help other people avoid the situation they just found themselves in. They can use that in public complaint as leverage a lot of times, and it's a lot easier to get on and send a 140 character tweet than it is to wait online or to come up with your or on the phone, wait on the phone, or to come up with a good email. Smart businesses know they have to recognize the importance of this communication channel. They got to be very proactive, join in the fun, make it as fun, embrace the comments, know you're going to get negative comments, monitor them, and answer them as quick as you can. When you have problems with orders, a lot of times direct strategy is the best way to do it. But if it's a big deal and a big order mishap, then you would want to switch to indirect strategy. Also, when we're telling bad news to the boss, we might want to really think about the degree of that news and what we should be using direct or indirect strategy. Um, there's a lot of different things we have to talk to our boss about bad things, talk to employees about performance. If you're in a managerial position, we might have to tell people about a loss of profits or a contract that we lost with a different company. So we also can use indirect strategy if we're doing this in person. And we would use kind of the same theories. We'd want to use it depending on how upset that person's going to be, even though it's face to face. When delivering bad news to individuals or groups, time it. Think about, we don't want to go tell the boss bad news when he's hungry and hasn't gone to lunch yet. We might want to do that after lunch. We want to be patient with people, give them time to react and blow up and then calm back down and then talk through it. It's usually a good idea to take someone with you when you're delivering bad news. It's also a good idea to rehearse so that you're not fumbling your words. It's bad enough to hear bad news. If you have to hear it and it's poorly communicated, is even worse. So make sure that you're doing that and use that little technique we talked about earlier, that past, present, and future. Um, uh, Also, we want to make sure that when we're delivering bad news to employees and the public, that we think about these key elements. Go ahead and take time to look over those. Most organizations, that when they have crisis, they try to be very open with their communication. They're very honest. They're very prompt. And we also take a look in your textbook. There's some information in there if you are in a managerial position, when you have to say no to job applicants and how to do that in a very not too blunt way, but concise way, and ways that would avoid having any kind of discrimination actions or wrongful actions brought up against the company. Great chapter. Hope that you don't have any trouble maneuvering through it. As always, if you have any questions,